The moment Brandon Cole leaned across the linen table and asked me how it felt, I knew my marriage had become a presentation Lauren forgot I could read. At the company dinner, every smile had been polished before I arrived. Lauren Mercer walked beside me through the glass doors of a Chicago steakhouse, wearing a black dress and the kind of confidence she normally saved for people she wanted to impress. She had touched my arm in the Uber and whispered, "Please, just be normal tonight," as if I had planned to arrive wearing disappointment instead of a charcoal blazer. Inside, her coworkers filled a private dining room with expensive laughter, wine glasses, and talk about quarterly wins, client growth, and the Northbridge Capital account. Everyone seemed desperate to land. Lauren introduced me as my husband Daniel. He does consulting, then let the sentence fall flat like a napkin dropped under the table. Not Daniel Mercer. Not the man who had helped her survive unpaid internships and student loans. Not even the person who had picked her up from the same office during winter storms when her first boss forgot she existed. Just consulting. Brandon noticed the opening immediately. He sat 2 seats from Lauren with his jacket unbuttoned, his watch displayed, and his voice pitched for the whole room. Every story he told ended with someone praising him, and every time Lauren laughed, his eyes slid toward me to check whether I understood my place. I understood it better than he did. The waiter placed ribeye plates, salmon, lemon wedges, and roasted potatoes around the table, while Brandon described the Northbridge pitch like he had personally rescued the company from bankruptcy. Lauren smiled at him in that careful, admiring way she used to reserve for me when I solved a problem before she had to ask. I waited for her to bring me into the conversation as her husband, not as a prop beside the breadbasket. She did not. Brandon raised his glass and said, "Lauren has been carrying this campaign on her back. Some of us actually like partners who can keep up." A few people laughed because office humor often means laughing before deciding whether something was cruel. Lauren's smile twitched but stayed in place. I looked at her, waiting for one sentence, one small correction, one signal that the man insulting me had crossed a line she still recognized. She lifted her water glass instead. That was when Brandon leaned forward. His grin was not drunken or careless. It was rehearsed. "How does it feel, Daniel," he asked, "to watch your wife finally sit at the grown-ups table?" The room went quiet in the fake way polite rooms do when everyone wants permission to enjoy someone else's humiliation. I heard the ice in my glass shift. I heard Lauren inhale. I heard my phone buzz against my thigh. On the screen was an email preview from Northbridge Capital. "Final risk review confirmed for tonight, Mr. Mercer." I almost laughed then, but not loudly. Loud men announce power because they need the room to believe it. Quiet men wait to see who abuses the room before the truth walks in. So I smiled. Not a big smile. Not the kind that begs for applause. Just a small, tired curve at the corner of my mouth that made Brandon's confidence flicker for half a second. Lauren noticed it too. Her fingers tightened around her glass. Brandon said, "What is funny?" I folded my napkin once and placed it beside my plate. "Nothing," I said. "I was just curious." "About what?" "About how your team treats people when you think nobody important is watching." The table shifted. Brandon laughed too hard. Lauren whispered my name, but it sounded less like concern and more like fear. She knew enough about me to know I did not make careless comments in crowded rooms. She did not know why. Across the room, the hostess opened the private door, and a man in a navy suit stepped inside, scanning the tables. When his eyes found me, his face brightened with recognition, and Brandon's smile finally began to die slowly. The man in the navy suit was Peter Langford, Northbridge Capital's senior partner, and the only person in that room who knew why I had been invited without being announced. He crossed the private dining room with a calm smile, passing Brandon's frozen glass, Lauren's tightening mouth, and 3 executives suddenly remembering to sit straighter. I stood because manners mattered even when people did not. Peter shook my hand and said, "Daniel, I am glad you made it. We wanted your eyes on the final review before tomorrow's vote." The silence changed shape. It was not pity anymore. Fear arrived. Brandon blinked like a man trying to recognize a language after mocking the alphabet. Lauren looked from Peter to me, then down at the email, still glowing on my phone. I placed it face down. I did not want the table watching my screen. I wanted them watching themselves. Peter greeted the CEO, Margaret Wells, then mentioned that Northbridge preferred informal dinners because people were often more honest before contracts made them careful. That was the first crack. Brandon laughed weakly and said, "We were just having fun." Peter glanced at me. "Were you?" he asked. Nobody answered him immediately. I sat again and felt Lauren's knee shift away from mine onto the table. That small movement told me more than her silence had. She was not confused. She was recalculating. A minute earlier, I had been the harmless husband she could under-describe. Now I was a variable in the deal her department had been chasing for 6 months. Brandon adjusted his cuff and tried to recover with a joke about consultants appearing everywhere. I let him. Men like Brandon think every pause is surrender because they have never met patients wearing a blazer at the right table before dinner. Lauren finally touched my sleeve. "Daniel," she whispered, "what is going on?" I turned slightly toward her. "You tell me." Her face tightened because she knew I was not asking about Northbridge. I was asking about the whole evening, the weak introduction, the careful distance, the way she had let Brandon turn me into a joke and then waited to see whether I would swallow it. She opened her mouth, but Margaret Wells asked Peter whether the risk review was complete. Peter said, "Almost." Mr. Mercer had concerns about 3 areas, and tonight may help clarify them for everyone here. Brandon's expression flashed from amusement to calculation. "Concerns?" he said. "The proposal is clean. I have been leading that account personally." That was exactly the problem. He wanted the room to know his ownership before he understood what ownership included. I unfolded my napkin again, not because I needed it, but because my hands needed something ordinary to do. Lauren stared at me with the shock of a woman discovering that the quiet part of her life had doors she had never opened. I asked Brandon what retention figure he had used for the Midwest rollout in his forecast deck. He answered too fast. 84%. I nodded. Interesting. The draft Northbridge received shows 71 before adjustment. Margaret turned toward Brandon. He cleared his throat and said the higher number reflected optimism after Lauren's campaign revisions. Lauren's eyes widened because he had just attached her name to a number I already knew had no backup. I did not look at her. If she wanted to stand near Brandon when he looked powerful, she could learn what proximity felt like when the floor moved. Peter asked whether those revisions had documentation. Brandon said, "We can get that later tonight." Later tonight was corporate language for not in the file. The CEO's mouth tightened. Around the table, people stopped pretending to eat. Brandon shot Lauren a look, and she looked at me, suddenly desperate for the husband she had been embarrassed to claim 10 minutes earlier. I thought about the Uber, her warning to be normal, her hand sliding from mine when Brandon approached, her silence when he asked how it felt. She had not been surprised by the question. She had been surprised by my smile. That difference mattered more than Northbridge or any contract in that room tonight. Brandon's mistake was assuming my silence meant I had no history with rooms like that. I had sat through dinners where a single percentage point could move millions of dollars, and I had learned early that loud confidence often entered first because the truth preferred a later reservation. Lauren used to admire that about me. When we met, she was 28, drowning in student debt, driving a dented Corolla, and practicing interview answers in our apartment kitchen until midnight. She wanted corporate life the way some people want air, not luxury, but escape, proof, a badge that said she belonged somewhere expensive. I believed in her before her coworkers learned to pronounce her name correctly. I paid the last $2,000 of her tuition when she called it temporary and promised to pay me back. I never asked. I fixed the heater in January while she studied market segmentation. I drove her to networking breakfasts at 6 in the morning, then went to client meetings with coffee on my tie. I made introductions quietly because she hated feeling helped. That was the bargain I thought marriage allowed. I would build scaffolding, and she would climb without being embarrassed. At first, she climbed with gratitude. She would text me from office bathrooms before presentations, asking whether her voice sounded steady. I would answer between calls, telling her to breathe and trust the numbers. She called me her anchor then. Anchors are loved until the boat decides they are the reason it cannot drift toward brighter water. After her promotion, the compliments changed her. People praised her ambition, her polish, her instinct. Brandon praised those things louder than anyone. He made admiration feel like a spotlight, and I became the shadow she did not want in company photographs. She stopped asking what I thought before big meetings. She started saying, "You would not understand the politics." At home, her stories included Brandon more often than budgets. Brandon said this. Brandon thinks that. Brandon believes I should push harder. I noticed, but I did what steady men often do when love is slipping. I explained it kindly to myself. Work stress, new circle, long hours, harmless admiration. The easiest lies are the ones that sound compassionate toward the person telling them. By the time I realized her distance was not accidental, she had already learned to call my concern insecurity. That night, with Peter standing beside our table and Brandon sweating through a smile, I saw the full pattern. Lauren had not merely failed to defend me. She had brought me where I would be measured by people she thought outranked me, then looked disappointed when I did not shrink correctly. Margaret Wells asked whether the 71% figure or the 84% figure should be considered official. Brandon said the difference was context. Peter said context usually comes with documentation. I kept my voice mild and asked whether the cost transfer from media spend to strategic consulting had been approved by finance. The table went still again. That item was not a small error. It made the campaign look cleaner by hiding expenses in a category most executives skimmed. Brandon looked at Lauren. Lauren looked at her plate. That silence answered two questions at once. She had known enough to worry, but not enough to stop him. I felt no triumph, only a cold confirmation settling inside my ribs. The man who asked how it felt had been bluffing with numbers he could not defend, and my wife had been sitting close enough to his confidence to borrow its shine. Margaret requested the full backup file before dessert. Brandon said he would send it immediately. Peter thanked him with the kindness professionals use when they have already decided to inspect every drawer. Lauren finally whispered, "Daniel, can we talk outside?" I looked at her hand hovering near my sleeve, the same hand that had not moved when Brandon mocked me. "Not yet," I said. Her face paled, because the review was no longer about a contract. It had become a mirror, and everyone at that table was beginning to recognize who had been posing in front of it. The backup file arrived at the table before the cheesecake did, because panic moves faster than dessert in corporate America. Brandon pulled his laptop from a leather case with fingers that no longer looked casual, clicked through folders, and tried to explain that the numbers were living documents. Peter Langford smiled politely, which in finance means the blade is already clean. Margaret Wells leaned forward at the head of the table, her silver earrings catching the light as she asked why a client retention adjustment worth 13 percentage points had no source note. Brandon said the team had verbally aligned on it. Verbally aligned was the kind of phrase people use when truth never made it into email. I watched Lauren then, not Brandon. Her jaw tightened, and she stared at the water ring under her glass as if a wet circle could become a hiding place. She knew the adjustment had been discussed because I had seen her name in the draft comments during my review. She had not authored the deception, but she had stood close enough to hear it breathe. That distinction mattered professionally, but personally it barely helped. Brandon tried to steer the conversation back to market pressure, competitor behavior, and aggressive growth targets. I asked one question. If the market pressure justified the forecast, why had the original data been moved out of the executive summary after Lauren reviewed the deck? The room turned toward her. Lauren lifted her eyes slowly, and for the first time that night, she looked less embarrassed by me than afraid of what I knew. I did not enjoy it. People imagine moments like that feel like revenge, but revenge is hot, loud, and brief. What I felt was colder, heavier. The exhaustion of realizing my wife had let another man humiliate me while standing near a professional mess she hoped would become success before anyone inspected it. Margaret asked Lauren directly whether she had reviewed the altered version. Lauren swallowed. "I reviewed the presentation format," she said, "not the underlying finance assumptions." Brandon jumped in too quickly. "Exactly. She helped polish the story, not build the model." Peter wrote something in a small black notebook. Brandon saw it and went pale beneath the steakhouse lighting. Lauren looked wounded by his panic, and that hurt in a way I had not expected. Even now, when our marriage was cracking in public, her first instinct was to measure his danger. I set my glass down. Personal behavior reveals professional judgment, I said, not loudly enough to embarrass anyone more than they had embarrassed themselves. Brandon turned on me with a smile too thin to hold. "Come on, Daniel," he said. "This is clearly personal because you felt disrespected." I nodded. I did. Then I looked at Margaret. But the spreadsheet felt disrespected first. A nervous laugh escaped someone near the far end of the table before dying under Margaret's stare. Peter closed Brandon's laptop halfway, gently, as if handling evidence instead of equipment. He said Northbridge would pause the final vote until the full audit trail, source files, and expense approvals were delivered by noon tomorrow. That was not a cancellation. It was worse for Brandon. It was time. Time lets numbers confess without raising their voices. Lauren whispered my name again, but I kept my eyes on the table. A linen tablecloth, 9 plates, 12 glasses, 1 deal, and a marriage that had quietly become collateral. Brandon pushed back from his chair and said he needed to make a call. No one stopped him. Lauren started to follow, then caught herself when Margaret looked at her. That hesitation told me everything she had not said in the Uber, at the table, or when Brandon asked his little question. She was no longer choosing between me and Brandon. She was choosing between the story she wanted and the evidence finally refusing to stay quiet in that room anymore. Brandon did not make a call in the hallway. He made a performance. Through the glass beside the private dining room, I watched him pace near the coat check, phone pressed to his ear, shoulders squared for anyone still looking. He wanted the room to believe he was managing pressure, not running from questions. Lauren watched him too, and that was the part one could not ignore. Her body remained at the table, but her attention had followed him out like loyalty on a leash. Margaret spoke with Peter in low tones about audit trails, expense approvals, and whether Northbridge would need an independent data room. The executives around us suddenly discovered urgent reasons to study their plates. Nobody wanted to be caught smiling at a career problem until they knew whose career it was. Lauren leaned toward me. "Daniel, please," she whispered. "This is getting out of hand." I looked at her. It was out of hand when he used me as a joke, and you let the room decide whether it was funny. Her eyes shone, but tears at a steakhouse table are not always remorse. Sometimes they are damage control with mascara. I did not know he would say it like that. But you knew he would say something. She looked down. That was answer enough. I followed a ride there, the way she checked her lipstick twice in the Uber, the way she said Brandon might be a little intense tonight, and laughed like warning me, made it harmless. I thought of her hand leaving mine when we entered, as if marriage was acceptable in private, but inconvenient under company lighting. Peter asked whether I wanted to step away. I shook my head. Leaving would have turned truth into gossip. Staying made everyone keep their version in the room. Brandon returned with a refreshed smile and no refreshed facts. "Sorry about that," he said. "Client concern." Peter nodded. "Then you understand why unresolved documentation is serious." Brandon sat slowly. "Of course." Margaret asked him to send the original campaign file, not the presentation deck. His face tightened. "The original file is messy." "Then send the messy one," she said. "Clean lies fear messy truth." Lauren finally found her voice. "Margaret, I can help gather the files tomorrow." Brandon looked at her sharply, and for 1 second I saw the whole arrangement. He needed her useful, quiet, admired, and close enough to defend the polish, but far enough to absorb blame. I wondered whether she saw it too. Peter asked me to summarize my concerns for the record. I kept it simple. Retention figure unsupported. Expense category shifted. Revenue projection missing backup. No speech. No anger. Just 3 facts sitting down where Brandon's confidence had been. The table did not need drama. It needed oxygen. Brandon tried one last turn toward personal insult. Funny how Daniel suddenly cares about our work after sitting there silently all night. I answered, "I care before dinner. That is why I read the file." His mouth opened, then closed. Lauren stared at me with the kind of shock that comes when someone realizes a door they mocked was actually holding up the house. Dessert arrived untouched. Cheesecake, chocolate cake, berries, and coffee. The waiter sensed the temperature and escaped quickly. Margaret ended the dinner early, thanking everyone for their time with a voice that made the thank you sound like a warning. Peter told me Northbridge would be in touch by morning. Brandon stood too fast and knocked his napkin to the floor. No one picked it up. In the lobby, Lauren grabbed my sleeve. "You could have told me," she said. "You could have told me you were involved." I looked at her hand on my jacket, the same hand that had stayed still when respect would have cost her nothing. And what would that have changed? She blinked. "Everything." "Exactly," I said. "You only needed me to matter once you found out I mattered to them." Her face broke then, but mine did not. Some truths do not explode. They simply unlock a door you cannot close again. And I had already stepped through it alone. The Uber ride home felt longer than the 12 miles between the steakhouse and our condo in River North. Lauren sat beside me with her hands folded over her purse, staring through the window as Chicago lights slid across her face. She had spent the first 3 minutes whispering that I embarrassed her, then stopped when I asked whether Brandon had embarrassed me before or after she let him. The driver turned the radio lower without being asked. Even strangers understand when a marriage has become too loud for music. My phone buzzed twice before we reached Ohio Street. Northbridge had sent a formal notice requesting original files, audit trails, and expense approvals by noon. Peter copied me, Margaret, and 3 people with titles that made excuses expensive. Lauren read the email over my shoulder before I locked the screen. "You should have warned me," she said. I looked at her reflection in the dark glass. "I did warn you," I said. "For years. I warned you every time I asked why Brandon needed to be in every story you brought home." She turned toward me. "He is not what you think. Tonight, he was exactly what he thought he was." She closed her eyes, maybe because the sentence had nowhere soft to land. At home, the condo looked untouched by disaster. The lamp was on, the dishwasher hummed, and my shoes still sat by the entry mat. Ordinary things can become cruel when they keep pretending nothing happened. Lauren dropped her purse on the kitchen island and finally cried, not loudly, not theatrically, but with a tired shake in her shoulders. "I did not mean to make you feel small," she said. "I hung my blazer on the chair. But you allowed it because it made you feel bigger." She wiped her face and said Brandon understood the pressure at work. I almost admired how quickly she reached for his struggle before naming mine. "Did you know about the change numbers?" I asked. She shook her head too fast. "Not like that. Did you know he planned to mock me?" Silence answered before she did. "He joked about saying something. I told him not to be cruel." I laughed once quietly. "That is not a boundary, Lauren. That is a suggestion for someone you already trusted to cross it." She covered her mouth. "I like feeling respected there," she whispered. "At work, people listen to me. With you, I always felt like you had already seen every mistake I was trying to hide." For the first time that night, she sounded honest. Honest did not mean harmless. "So you let Brandon turn me into the mistake," I said. She looked up, frightened by the accuracy. Before she could answer, her phone rang. Brandon. The name lit the kitchen like a second insult. She did not pick it up. He texted instead, "We need one story tomorrow." Lauren stared at the screen, and whatever remained of her defense collapsed. I did not ask to read it. She turned the phone around herself. There it was, proof that Brandon did not want truth, only alignment. I took a screenshot with her permission, because after dinner, even grief needed documentation. "Daniel," she said, "what happens now?" I looked around the condo we had chosen together, the framed prints, the narrow balcony, the wedding photo on the shelf. The question should have been about Northbridge, but it was not. "Now," I said, "I stopped protecting versions of you that keep choosing him." She cried harder then, and I felt pain move through me without becoming surrender. That was new. The next morning, Northbridge postponed the vote. By 10, Brandon had sent 3 incomplete folders and 1 email blaming formatting issues. Margaret requested a forensic review. Lauren was asked to provide her comments and meeting notes. Brandon stopped calling her by lunch. When she saw that, she whispered, "He is saving himself." I nodded. People usually do when they realize admiration is not evidence. That afternoon, I packed a small overnight bag and booked a hotel downtown. The hotel was only 5 blocks from our condo, close enough to feel temporary and far enough to let me breathe. Lauren stood in the hallway while I packed, watching me fold shirts as if fabric could explain what words no longer could. "Are you leaving me?" she asked. I zipped the bag slowly. "Tonight, I am leaving the room where Brandon's name keeps ringing louder than mine." She flinched, but she did not argue. That told me she had started hearing it. I took my laptop, charger, passport folder, and the small notebook where I kept client notes. Years in risk consulting had taught me that when people panic, they do not only rewrite stories, they misplace blame. Lauren followed me to the door. "I gave them everything I had," she said. "My comments, meeting notes, draft versions. I am not protecting him." I looked at her hand, gripping the doorframe. "You protected the mood at dinner when he mocked me. That was enough." Her eyes filled again. "I was ashamed. Of him," she swallowed. "Of how you looked sitting there so quiet." There was uglier because it was honest. She had not been ashamed of Brandon's cruelty. She had been ashamed that my calm looked unimpressive beside his performance. I nodded, because some answers hurt less when you stop asking them to become apologies. At the hotel, I checked into a small room overlooking the river. Chicago moved below the window in headlights. All motion, no comfort. I placed my wedding ring on the nightstand, not as a decision, but a question I was too tired to hold. By morning, Northbridge's review had widened. Peter called before 8. "Daniel, the original file does not match the executive deck. We found expense movement. Brandon is claiming Lauren approved the final numbers." I closed my eyes. Of course he was. Men who borrow admiration often return debt to the nearest woman. "Do the comments support that?" I asked. "Not fully. Her notes show presentation edits, but she flagged one missing source. Then the flag disappears in Brandon's version." I thanked him and ended the call. Lauren texted seconds later. "He's saying I signed off." I did not. I believed that part. Belief is not the same as rescue. I wrote, "Send everything through company channels. Do not call him privately." She replied, "I already blocked him." That should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt late. Around noon, Margaret Wells placed Brandon on administrative leave pending the internal review. The news traveled faster than official language could control it. Coworkers who had laughed at dinner suddenly sent Lauren cautious messages asking whether she was okay, which meant they were checking which side was safe. She forwarded none of them to me, but she did send one screenshot. "He told people you and your husband planned this to embarrass him." I stared at the screen and almost admired the reach. Last night, I had been nobody. Today I was conspiracy. That is how fragile status works. It only respects power after accusing it of being unfair. Lauren called from a conference room. Her voice sounded flat. "Margaret asked why I let him talk to you like that." "What did you say?" I said I thought it was harmless office banter. I said nothing. She whispered. Then she asked why harmless needed an audience. That was the first sentence from someone else that sounded like my marriage. For a long moment, I listened to the faint office hum behind her, printers, footsteps, doors closing softly. "Daniel," she said, "I'm starting to understand." I looked at the river outside my hotel window. "Understanding after consequences is still understanding," I said. "But it is not the same as loyalty before them." She cried quietly. I did not comfort her, and that absence felt brutal until I realized she had survived my discomfort at that table just fine. That evening, Peter sent the official notice. Northbridge suspended the vote and required an independent review. Brandon's promotion was frozen. Lauren was not cleared, but she was not the center of the issue either. When she asked if I was coming home, I looked at the ring on the nightstand and answered, "Not tonight." The next 3 days taught me that distance does not make pain smaller. It makes excuses easier to hear. From my hotel room above the river, I watched Chicago move like a city that had no interest in one ruined dinner, while Lauren sent updates from her office in careful, frightened bursts. Brandon had stopped texting her directly, which meant he was either listening to counsel or looking for someone else to blame. Margaret Wells requested every version of the Northbridge presentation, and the audit trail showed exactly what Peter suspected. The original numbers were cautious, the executive deck was inflated, and the expense shift happened after Brandon marked the file final. Lauren's comments were there too. Not criminal, not clean, not damning enough to destroy her career, but close enough to shame her. She had asked one question about the missing source note, then let Brandon close the thread with "handled offline." Handled offline is where weak judgment goes when it hopes nobody asks for a receipt. On the fourth evening, Lauren came to the hotel lobby. She wore a navy coat over her work clothes, her hair pulled back, her face stripped of the polished confidence she had carried into the steakhouse. I met her near the windows, where the river reflected office lights in broken gold lines. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different from dinner. There, silence had protected Brandon. Here, it finally had to answer for itself. Lauren placed her phone on the small table between us and said, "I told Margaret everything." I nodded. Everything is a word people use when they want confession to sound finished. She looked down. I told her I should have stopped him at dinner. I told her I knew he wanted to embarrass you, and I was more afraid of looking unprofessional than being disloyal. That sentence landed harder than any apology because it finally named the trade. She had exchanged my dignity for her office image. Not forever, maybe not even consciously, but long enough for Brandon to notice and use it. I asked, "Did you respect me less because I did not perform success the way he did?" Her eyes filled. "I respected you," she said, "but I stopped admiring what I understood." Then she corrected herself. "No, that is not fair. I stopped being curious. I let you become familiar, and I let him become impressive." It was the first honest cruelty she had offered me, and I appreciated it more than her tears. Honesty does not repair a wall, but at least it stops calling the crack a shadow. She said Brandon had been removed from the Northbridge account pending the independent review. His promotion was dead. Several people from the dinner had given statements. Someone admitted the joke at my expense had been discussed before we arrived. Lauren said it like the detail hurt her, but I could not tell whether it hurt because I was right or because others now knew. I asked whether she came to save the marriage or clean her conscience. She said both. I believed her. That was the problem. Love had never been absent from us. Respect had been left unattended until someone else felt invited to sit in its chair. She reached across the table, then stopped before touching my hand. That small restraint mattered. For once, she did not assume access. "Daniel," she said, "what do you want me to do?" I looked past her at the elevators, where strangers kept arriving with luggage, takeout bags, and ordinary plans. I wanted the answer to be simple. I wanted to say fire Brandon, apologize publicly, come home early, choose me louder. But those were instructions for behavior, not evidence of character. So I told her the truth. I want to stop auditioning for a place I already earned. She cried then, quietly, and this time I let myself feel sad without moving closer. By morning, Northbridge confirmed the review would continue without Brandon leading the file, and Lauren's company asked her to step back from client contact until findings were complete. I read the notice, packed my bag, and chose distance again. 1 week later, Northbridge closed the review with the kind of language companies use when they want consequences to sound professional. Brandon Cole was terminated for misconduct, unsupported forecasting, and improper expense classification. The deal was not canceled, but it was delayed, resized, and moved under Margaret Wells directly. Lauren was written up for poor judgment and removed from client presentations for 90 days. She kept her job, but the office stopped treating her like the rising star Brandon had promised she was. Admiration had a billing cycle, and his came due first. She told me all this over coffee in the lobby of my hotel, her hands wrapped around a paper cup she never drank. "I know I lost your respect," she said. I watched people roll suitcases across the marble floor and thought about how many years I had spent making her life easier without needing witnesses. "You lost my trust before you knew I had influence," I said. "That is the part you still do not understand." Lauren nodded slowly. "I thought if people at work admired me, it meant I had become someone important. And what did my admiration mean?" She looked down. "Something safe enough to neglect." That answer did not save us, but it honored the damage better than any apology before it. By then, I had moved into a small furnished apartment in Lincoln Park on a 3-month lease. It was not glamorous. The bedroom barely fit a queen bed, the radiator clanked at night, and the kitchen counter was too narrow for 2 cutting boards. But nobody in that apartment needed to be reminded to say my name with respect. I worked, cooked badly, walked along the lake when the weather allowed, and answered Lauren's messages only when they were about practical things. Distance became less dramatic once it had furniture. Northbridge eventually approved a smaller contract with stricter controls. Peter thanked me for my discretion. Margaret sent a formal note apologizing for the dinner environment, which was corporate wording for we all saw it. I kept the note, not because I needed validation, but because sometimes your memory deserves backup when your heart tries to soften the facts. Brandon never contacted me again. Men like him do not return to rooms where their reflection has already been corrected. Lauren asked me to come home twice. The first time, she promised things will be different. The second time, she said the condo felt empty without me. I believed both statements, but belief was no longer enough to move my suitcase. A marriage cannot survive only because one person misses the comfort of the other person's presence after disrespect becomes inconvenient. On a cold Sunday evening, I returned to the condo to collect the rest of my things. Lauren had taken our wedding photo off the shelf and placed it on the dining table. "Are you really leaving because of one dinner?" she asked. I looked at the picture, 2 people smiling before ambition learned to imitate intimacy. "No," I said. "I'm leaving because that dinner showed me where I had been standing long before I stood up." Her face folded, and for a moment I wanted to comfort her the old way, quickly, instinctively, at the cost of my own clarity. Instead, I picked up the box with my books, my passport folder, and the watch my father gave me. At the door, Lauren said, when he asked how it felt, I should have answered for you. I turned back. You already did. The hallway was quiet after that. Downstairs, Chicago wind pushed between the buildings, sharp and clean. I carried my box to the curb and did not look up at our windows. I had not smiled that night because I wanted Brandon ruined. I smiled because the truth had finally arrived on time. It showed me the coworker, the company, the deal, and most painfully my wife. She had waited to value me until other people did. By then, the part of me she wanted back had already learned how to leave. I chose peace over being proven right, and that choice felt like home finally.